right, what's up, Greenville? Yeah, good to see everybody this morning. So we have been in this rather long series on heroes of the faith, and that's because there's a whole bunch of them in the Bible. And so I just love looking at these historical people and these historical events. And really, we've been really diving in deep into these stories and learning the history and the truth of these stories and what God intended them for. And it's really been a cool ride. And we're going to continue that today. And our next hero is Esther. I'll give you a few seconds to turn to the Book of Esther because the scriptures aren't going to be up on the screen. I am reading from the NIV. So just to kind of put things into perspective of where we are, you've got Moses and the Exodus, and you've got where the Israelites were taken into the Promised Land. And remember, all Moses asked was, look, be faithful to the covenant that you made with God. Do what you said you would do. Obey God's commands. That's all he asked. And all throughout history, you had this issue of people screwing that up. And then you had this era, this time frame of the prophets, where the prophets would come and talk to God and tell you what the words God had for you, and basically warn you, say, y'all need to get your stuff together. And we continue to screw that up, or God's people continue to screw that up. And because of that, God allowed the Israelites, the Jewish people, the Hebrews, however you want to call them, God's people, to be conquered. And to be conquered by these folks you may remember from history or from the Bible, being conquered by the Assyrians, then they were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and then after that you had Persia come in. Okay, so they all kind of took turns coming in and taking over that land. So when we get to the book of Esther, we are really in that Persian rule, in that time frame. So this is about 900 years after Moses. This is about 500 years after King David and 100 years after the Babylonian exile, just to kind of give you some timeline and some perspective on that. Along with being conquered, okay, they were exiled, meaning they were kind of kicked out of the main area and they were scattered all over the place. So they were exiled out of their promised land. And some of the Jews during this time of Esther, they were, first of all, allowed to go back to Jerusalem under Persian rule. They were allowed to go back to Jerusalem. And some of God's people did go back, and some of them did not. So when these people are going back to Jerusalem, this is in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. You all might be familiar with those books and those stories. So Esther's kind of in and around that time frame as well. So you got these people going back, these Jewish people, God's people, going back to the Promised Land. And you got some that just didn't. They may have been too old to travel back. Maybe they were comfortable where they were in some ways, but some of them didn't go back. And that's really where we're at in the book of Esther. We have this Jewish community, a large community, okay, of Jews that did not return to Jerusalem, that are living in this capital city of Persia known as Susa. So that's where we're at as we're looking at the book of Esther. Now, I'm going to narrate some, and then we'll dive in and read some of the scripture as well. So in Esther chapter 1, we meet King Xerxes. So he's the Persian king, and he's exactly what you would expect a king to be like. He was kind of arrogant. He was mean in many ways. It was his way or the die way, because there was no highway. You're going to die if it wasn't his way. That's just the way it was. Basically, King Xerxes says, I'm going to throw a party, and this is going to be one of the biggest, baddest parties around. This party is going to last 7 days. 7 days, y'all. Now, this is like a drinking party, too. I mean, they had wine and all those kinds of things. And I mean, everybody that was anybody, however you want to say it, all the cool people came to this party, right? And everybody was there. And 7 days, they're drinking, they're partying, they're having a good time. And it's basically to celebrate the king. He's having a party to celebrate himself. That's kind of like having your own birthday party and inviting people. He is inviting people, come celebrate me and my awesomeness. And I mean, it was very extravagant, big, huge party. So the women are partying kind of separate. So you got the guys having their party, the kings, they got the officials and servants and nobles and princes, and the women are having their separate party. And King Xerxes says, bring my queen, bring her, Vashti, Queen Vashti, bring her to the party on this side, the fellas' party, because I need me some arm candy, right? I'm going to walk around with my queen, show everybody how beautiful and awesome she is, so everybody can go, dang, look at the queen. The king's got to be lucky. I mean, he's blessed with all this stuff. He's awesome, obviously. Well, Queen Vashti, I don't know what got into her. Maybe they were getting their drink on too. But she said, I ain't going over there. I'm not going to that party. You tell the king I'm not coming. Well, what did I say about the kind of character and the kind of person the king was? He was not having it. He lost his mind about the fact that the queen was not coming when the king summoned her. So it's at this point that he talks to his advisors and he says, what can we do about this? What's the law? You know, how are we to proceed? And basically they say, look, you need to cut her off. She can't be queen anymore. So he makes a royal decree that permanently bans the Queen Vashti from his presence. She can't even be around anymore, not much less queen. So, needless to say, he had lost his mind about that taking place. So then, in chapter 2, begins this search for a new queen, because the king can't be without a queen, and the queen can't have somebody who's disrespected him. So it's time to find a new queen. Well, let me tell you, the events of finding a new queen, when you read through chapter 2, it's like an episode of The Bachelor. You wonder where they got the idea from that? It was chapter 2 of Esther. Basically, they gathered all of these women. Okay? They gathered them. They went and got them. It wasn't like that they wanted to. They were basically voluntold that you need to come. So, and it was like the most beautiful women of all of the beautiful women in the kingdom. And they were virgins. So there was like 360 estimated women that were brought to the king for this episode of The Bachelor. And the idea was for these candidates to basically get to know the king. There were some other things that would transpire, and he would pick which one was going to be queen. So this is also when we meet Esther. When you first start reading chapter 2, it says Hadassah. That was her Hebrew name. And oftentimes, if you were conquered by somebody like Persia, they gave you a Persian name, and her Persian name was Esther. So if you read that, you're like, who that? Hadassah is Esther, okay? Esther is raised by Mordecai. So Mordecai and his family, as part of the exile out of their promised land, is exiled out. Esther's parents die. Mordecai is Esther's cousin, much older cousin, basically raises her. He loves her and raises her like a father or like a daughter. So Esther is one of them pretty ladies who's a virgin, and they go get her along with these women and bring them to the harem. And let me tell you about what that is for just a minute. So there's this cat named Haggai. Okay, and there's a couple of Haggais throughout the Bible, so don't get confused with some of them. This particular Haggai is a eunuch, which means, it's weird, but he's been castrated. Okay, and he's a eunuch. And he is responsible for managing the women in the harem, which is basically like the women's quarters. In some ways, I could see probably why you would castrate the servant who's going to be watching over all of the women. I wouldn't sign up for that job. I'm pretty sure the turnover was pretty bad. But that was the responsibility of that person to take care of the king's women. Okay? And these women could have been his wives, servant women, just women that he had sexual relationships with. That was Haggai's job. Haggai's job was also, when they brought these 360 women to the king, Haggai was responsible for getting them ready, making them look pretty, giving them beauty treatments and things like that, teaching them how to be proper, okay, so that they could impress the king. And this went on for 12 months before they went to go see the king, or up to 12 months, I should say, before they would be taken to the king. And what they would do is they would stay with the king overnight. And they would play things like Scrabble and Yahtzee and those types of things. That's right. Boom. If you're going to the king's place and hang out overnight, you know what's going down. Okay? I said it's the episode of The Bachelor. When he was done, that next morning, the women would return back to the harem, or the women's quarters, and they would find out if they would be summoned for round 2. Okay? So the king would, if he was pleased with them, would call them by name and say, okay, yeah, I really liked her a whole lot. Bring her back and we'll start, weeding them out and seeing which one I want to choose as queen. Pretty crazy, right? So Esther, who again is there and doesn't really want to be there, probably most of the women didn't want to be there, has won the favor of Haggai, the one who's taking care of the women. Haggai we're talking about like a covenant type of friendship, like a relationship, an appreciation for who Esther was and the type of person she was. She wasn't just beautiful, but she was a special person inside and out, very humble, very loyal. So Haggai kind of gives her some pointers because he really likes her and favors her over all of the other women. Up to this point, remember, they were exiled from their promised land and they were living in Persia. So they're living as Jews, as Hebrews, as God's people, the Israelites. They're living in a foreign land. And nobody knows at this point that Esther is a Jew or an Israelite, Hebrew, whatever. Nobody knows that at this point. Mordecai does and says, keep that a secret. I don't want you telling anybody about that. So at this point, this whole show is going on, and Mordecai is like just pacing at the city gates. This is where everything went down, the city gates. And he's just kind of pacing, trying to get word about how things are going with Esther, what's going on, and those types of things. And Esther goes to be with, it's her turn, basically, and wins the favor of the king. And the king chooses Esther to be queen. He loves her so much and thinks she's so awesome and amazing, not just because she's beautiful on the outside, but she's beautiful and special on the inside. So much that when he made her queen, they had this celebration. They made it a national holiday. They had this huge party to celebrate Queen Esther. So if I go back for just a second, I want to share with you. So remember when I talked about Mordecai was kind of pacing back and forth out by the city gates? As it turned out, Mordecai, why he was doing that, and they also thought that he might be a Persian official, that he would be around, in that area and around the king's soldiers and officials and things like that. He overheard two guys talking who were obviously disgruntled about their jobs. They were plotting to kill the king. They were going to kill him. And Mordecai reported their plan to Esther. And so Esther went and told the king what was about to happen. And that's exactly true. It was a known fact. And they investigated and discovered, and they impaled those two guys on poles, on trees, basically. Imagine being punctured through their bodies, displayed for everybody to see that you don't plot anything against the king. And this was recorded in this book of Chronicles, if you will. They were really good at documenting all the events and all the things that took place, and obviously that these guys were convicted. But Mordecai didn't get any love. He didn't get any parties thrown for him for saving the king. And the story moves on in Esther chapter 3. So at this point, about 4 years have passed, and we meet this cat named Haman. Now, Haman, he basically rose to power, became kind of like this prime minister or principal advisor of the king. He's the second in command. That's who he is. The king actually makes a decree that everybody is to bow in Haman's presence. So whenever that happens, well, Mordecai, remember Esther's cousin who raised her, has a problem with bowing down to Haman. Now here's the problem. Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites. So the Amalekites and the Jews do not look at each other well. So imagine, you got Amalekites who's basically killed your family and done things to your family. You've done things to them in battle that was terrible and all these types of things. So if there's any descendants, they know the history, they have issues. So Mordecai's like, I am not bowing to him, to Haman. There is no way because of who he is and who his descendants are. So Haman finds out about Mordecai and who he is, and that he won't bow, and that he is part of the Jewish nation. Guys, let's look what it says in Esther chapter 3, verse 8. It says, Then Haman said to King Xerxes, There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Verse 9. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents, that's like 375 tons, of silver to the king's administration for the royal treasure. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman. And then verse 11, he basically says, the king says to him, Keep the money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you please. So he hasn't said who the people are. He hasn't said that they're Jewish people, Israelite, Hebrew people. He hasn't said who they are. He just said there's these people. Okay? And then in verse 14, a copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so they would be ready for that day. So basically, this is being announced to everybody that God's people are going to be slaughtered and killed. Basically because Haman said so. And Haman said that they were a threat, while really it was just his personal vendetta against Mordecai and the Jewish people. So then verse 15, the couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink. They were chill after that. They got this edict to destroy this entire nation of people, and they kick back and have a drink and just kind of chill out about it. So the entire area is freaking out at this point because there are so many Jewish people and people that I may not be that nationality, but those are my friends, though. And these people are going to be killed because of Haman's order. So it's as if Haman is like the Old Testament kind of Hitler of the day to kill the Jewish people. Then in Esther chapter 4, Mordecai finds out, obviously, because He's a Jew, and he knows that he and his family and his people are going to be killed. And he tries to persuade Esther to go talk to the king. Now listen, because this is a big deal. We're going to be Esther chapter 4, verse 9. Okay, this is very important. Haddock went back and reported to Esther that what Mordecai had said. So basically you got this, hey, I need you to go tell Mordecai this. Mordecai sends a messenger to there, because you can't text back then and stuff. So there's messages going back and forth. And this Haddock is helping with that. Verse 10. So here's what she said. She instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned. Okay, so the king has to call for you to come forth. You can't just go, yo, king, hey, man. There's no open door policy back then, okay, with the king. And that is the law. So if you broke that law, you were put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. So that's how you know the king will extend his golden scepter and you're like, whew, okay, then we're good. Okay? But nobody's going to try that. Nobody's going to roll the dice and see what happens. She goes on to say, but 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So imagine this for just a minute. She doesn't even know if she's still in his good graces. She hasn't seen him in 30 days. He's got all these other women. He's got, he's busy, all these things he's doing. She hadn't even seen him in 30 days, so she's worried about that as well. And then in verse 12, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back the answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. So this is kind of Mordecai trying to talk some sense into her a little bit. Verse 14. For if you remain silent, okay, so if you don't go and talk to the king about this, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. So he's saying, look, if you won't do it, somebody else is going to do it. Okay, and you might not be saved in the process. So he's trying to encourage her. And then says, and who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. So Mordecai is basically saying, listen, it's crazy that you are queen right now. Think about all that's transpired for you to get here. Is it possible that you are in this position representing God's people for such a time as this? Don't let this opportunity pass by. That's what Mordecai is saying. Verse 15. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. So not like fast, run fast, but actually stop eating. Go before the Lord and pray. So we know that Esther and her people sought God and prayed and sought his guidance. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So this is a big deal. We think, yeah, man, he loves her. Of course, he's going to let her come in. No, think about what happened to Queen Vashti for just not coming to the party. You're out. You're cut off. You lose your job. I don't want you around no more, ever. Right? So what's going to happen when she breaks the law and goes to the king, and the law is that she is to be killed? He's going to follow the law. That's her fear. In chapter 5, this is when Esther approaches the king. Check this out. We're about to find out what happens. On the third day, this is verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robe, stood in the inner court. So imagine, she puts on a royal robe, curls her hair, looks pretty, and is going to the royal court to see the king. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance, when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was ticked off and said, kill her. That's not what it says, but that's what could have happened. All right? So, when he saw, verse 2, when he saw the Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out his royal scepter to her. So imagine her relief at that point. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, as you were supposed to do in that time. Then the king asked, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom I will give you. If it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. The king's like, bring Haman at once, right? If that's the request, all she asked was time with the king and time with the second in command, Haman. That's her request. And then what we read about is that Haman feels like VIP, right? I mean, he's like, look, man, the queen requested to have just a personal meal with me and the king. I'm feeling pretty good about this. And they actually sit down and they have their meal, and the king says, what is it that you want? Is this it? And she says, well, let's have another meal tomorrow, and I will have my answer for you for what my request is. And he said, I'll give you half of the kingdom. But she says, one more meal tomorrow, okay? One more meal, and then I'll tell you for sure what it is. So in the meantime, Haman's still fired up about Mordecai. He's actually constructed this pole that's 75 feet tall in front of his house, out in front of where he lives, to impale Mordecai. Think about that for just a second. This dude's crazy to do that. And that's what's going on at this point. And then in Esther chapter 6, we learn that King Xerxes couldn't sleep. He was having a hard time. You know, he had a bunch of caffeine that day. It was a stressful day. And what does he do? Does he count sheep? No. He reads. What does he read? These chronicles that they used to document all the events of their kingdom or their empire. That's his leisure reading. That would help me sleep too. Okay, so it's probably a good idea. But he's reading it so he can read about himself and about how awesome he is. Well, he discovers that, oh yeah, I forgot what Mordecai did. He saved me from being killed. Remember the plan when Mordecai was walking around the gates? And he asked his servants, did we ever do anything for Mordecai? And they're like, no, you didn't. Actually, you didn't say anything to him. So he's like, well, we need to have a party. We need to celebrate. We need to recognize this guy. So the servants, he says, go get Haman, second in command. Go get Haman. And he pulls Haman over and he says, I got a question for you. And in Esther chapter 6, verse 6, check this out. This is hysterical, I think. Anyway, so when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for a man the king delights to honor? Simple question, right? What should we do for somebody like that? Didn't say who the man was. Now Haman, thinking to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? Haman's thinking. So here's his response in verse 7. So he answered the king. For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and the horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princesses. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done to the man or for the man the king delights to honor. So he's saying, this is what I would do, king, thinking that this might be for myself. Give him a robe, make everybody just talk about how awesome he is, parade him down the city and say, this is the guy that honors the king. This guy right here. And then King Xerxes responds in verse 10. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. And then in verse 11, so Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Haman is mortified. He's like, you got to be kidding me. He goes home, he tells his wife, he tells his advisors, you ain't going to believe what happened. Oh my gosh, what's supposed to happen? They're like, you're toast, bro. You are toast. Because you have also made it to where we're going to kill all his people. That's not a good place to be for the man that the king honors. So while he's losing his mind and going, oh my gosh, what the heck is going to happen right now? Then the king's eunuchs come and go, hey dude, bro, you didn't get your calendar reminder, man. You got dinner with the king and Esther. He's like, oh, you got to be kidding me. So now he's going to this dinner, the second dinner. And in chapter 7, the king asks, what is your request? Up to half of my kingdom. And then in verse 3, Queen Esther finally answers, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. Let me pause. Imagine what the king is thinking at this point. Grant you your life? What? And she continues, this is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept it quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing? Where is he? So the queen hasn't alluded to who her people are or anything. He just wants to know, who is this cat that's threatening my wife and her people? Verse 6. Esther said, an adversary and enemy, the vile Haman. Imagine being at the mill, and you know, Haman's probably sitting there going, and then all of a sudden it's him, and he's like, what? Huh? Who? I'm not trying to kill you. Who are your people? What's going on? What is going on here? Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Verse 7. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? So this is what happened. Queen Esther said, it's Haman. He's the one. And the king gets up and, that's my second in command. What's going on? This is crazy. And he walks out, which is kind of weird. He walks out and comes back. Well, while he was out, Haman is begging the queen, please, please, please save me. Get me out of this. And he's, down at she's kind of reclined on the couch where they're eating. And he's at her feet and just almost looks like he's groveling, right? And the king walks in and is like, what are you doing? Get away from my queen. Are you trying to molest her or something? So, how do you think the king is going to respond to that? Off with his head, right? Something like that. Well, as it turns out, he orders that Haman is killed, and he is impaled on a pole, a 75-foot pole, that he erected to kill Mordecai, in front of his own home. Imagine that. And in Esther chapter 8, Haman's estate is given to Queen Esther. Mordecai is given the signet ring that basically says, I represent the king, right? There's a new edict or a new order to save the Jews because he couldn't change. Once something was put into law, you couldn't just change it. Okay, you couldn't say, my bad. That don't count. Okay? That still had to continue. So he had to kind of counter that edict or that law or that order. And he did so by basically saying the Jews can defend themselves. All right? And anybody who cares for the Jews can defend themselves, can defend the Jews. So that's basically what happens in this edict. Not only that, but many of the non-Jews became Jews or became part of God's people in this particular chapter. So things really turned out okay for God's people, the Jews. There's definitely more to the story, but that's the premise of the Book of Esther. A crazy story when you think of a hero of the faith. But at the same time, I'm like, why is this book in the Bible? Why is this? Because the Bible is a collection of books, right? Why is the Book of Esther in the Bible? There's no mention of God. There's no booming voice from God. There's no burning bush. There's nothing like that. Why is this story in there? And God's name isn't even mentioned. The only mention-ish of God is the fact that they would fast and pray, that Esther asked them to fast and pray. That's really kind of the only hint of God throughout the story of Esther. So why is it in there? So God may not be in the Book of Esther, but his hands and the finger of God is all over the Book of Esther. Think about it. Esther is nobody. Nobody. And in fact, a Jew. So kind of like those people, right? Not Persian, not royalty or anything like that. And you've got these events that transpire that look like coincidences. You've got the Bachelor show. She becomes queen. She manages to win the favor of Haggai and everybody and the king so much that she could approach him the way that she did without being summoned. The secret of keeping her nationality and not revealing that till the time that was necessary. Not recognizing Mordecai at the time of the event of saving the king, but that was like 5 years later. Why 5 years later? Why would he have a hard time sleeping and read that then? That's a coincidence. It's just coincidence. No! It's God's hands are all in the Book of Esther. It's all over the place. Because, see, Satan is constantly trying to destroy God's people. Satan is constantly trying to destroy Christianity today, God's people back then, and God is constantly working his plans and disrupting everything Satan has in store for us. So that's great for Esther. What about us, though? What can we get out of this story? Because if we're being honest, we want miracles. I want miracles. I want the Red Sea to split. I want the sun to turn purple. I want whatever. Right? We all do. We want natural things, for God to change natural things. We want God to take somebody who is sick and has cancer, and we want that healed, and we want them good as new. We want him to raise people in our lives from the dead, right? We want the miraculous. But when we talk about God's providence, He's not taking natural things and changing them into miracles. He's taking natural things and using those and still working them into his plan. But sometimes those things don't jump off the page at us. Sometimes those things don't jump into our minds as we're going through our lives. But we got to take time sometimes to just look back and think about God's providence, which is basically his providence, his divine providence, where his hands are in everything in our lives. Now you may be going, well, what about free will? If God's hands are in everything and he's pushing me this way and he's telling me to go that way, where does free will come into play? That's a fair question. But we still have free will. Just because miracles don't happen and God's hands just working in our lives, that's still divine activity, even though it's not a miracle like we think of a miracle. Think about this. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. Listen. Remember, it says, for we are God's masterpiece. You are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good things. Look at this. He planned for us long ago. Remember, we're created on purpose, for a purpose. And if that is the case, God is working those things out for us. He gives us free will, but he's working those things out in our lives, just like it did in the historical events of Esther. And it's hard to explain, and sometimes it's hard to see some of these things because of our limited vantage point. How many of you like mazes? I love walking through a maze, a corn maze, any kind of maze. When you're looking at the maze and you're at the doorway to enter into the maze, you just got these tall walls, whatever they may look like. And you get to one end of the corridor and it's turn right or left. And then you turn right and you may hit a dead end. And then you go back and then you're constantly retracting. But you have free will to go either direction and make whatever decisions you want to make. But when you think of God's view of things, it's more of an aerial view of what that maze looks like. Because he sees the big picture. You can choose. You're going to enter this way and you're going to exit over here. That's God's plan for you. I'm not talking about exiting this world. I'm saying whatever his plan is for you, as you progress through his maze, you may go right, you may go left, you may make these choices. You may do all of these things. Free will. But God is still working in the background. His godly providence, his godly provision to use you for the purpose that you were created. And regardless of which way you go, you're still going to be used for that purpose. That's God's providence. That's God's plan. So when we pray to God, it may not look like or be answered the way we think it looks. But God knows what's best and will provide and oftentimes answers prayers. And sometimes we're at the other end of the maze. Like I can look back personally. I'm at the end of the maze. I'm not dying, but I'm at the end of the maze at this point in my life, and I look back. Right? Have y'all ever got on the elevated part in the middle of the maze and you're like, oh, there it is. It's right there. I just got to follow that. You know what I'm talking about? You kind of get a peek of what God sees. You know what I'm saying? When you look back at the maze that you went through and you can go, oh my goodness, I can see how God is working in my life. When I think about the fact that I'm where I am today, sharing God's word with you, I can look at things back in my life and go, whoa. God's hands were all over that. Did he plan on 27 years at UPS to happen before I found out I was being called? He was probably calling me way before that. But Bobby had to choose his own path through the maze and go right and left, whichever way he wanted to go. But I still got to the point to where I'm created on purpose for a purpose, and that is to share God's word. And you all have a purpose, and then it may not be like this. And I only share that as my example. Your example may look like Esther's. Your example may look like Joseph in the Old Testament, the guy with the fancy coat, right? Your purpose may look, everybody's purpose is different. But everybody's purpose is special. And everybody's purpose is necessary for the big purpose, the big plan of God. So the question is not whether God is involved, it's how is He involved. And here's my response. You ready? I don't know. He's God and I'm not. You know, I got a cell phone. And I have no idea how that thing works. All I know is it works. I don't go, well, I'm not using this phone until somebody tells me how these mechanisms and things work in the cell phone. I'm not doing it. No. You'd be like, dude, you're crazy. Let them smart people figure that out. You can benefit from the phone. Just use the phone. Right? Makes sense? But when it comes to God, we don't do that. I gotta know. When is your plan for me? When is it? Am I supposed to go right? Am I supposed to go left? That's me. I don't know if y'all do that, but that's me. When I just need to say, dude, I don't care how you do it. You are the sovereign God that created the universe, and I haven't created one of those yet. So it might be that you just know, and I don't. But that doesn't mean that I can't benefit from your providence. That I can't benefit from your hand and finger in my life. And that is why I have faith. That is why every day when I wake up, I'm like, God's got this, no matter how jacked up or how good my life is. God's got me. Because I was created on purpose. For a purpose. I am His masterpiece. He created me and you, knowing how He was going to use you in advance. That is why we should have faith. That is why the book of Esther is in the Bible. And that is what we learn from that historical event and God's providence.